recent poll shows that 45% of Americans are either very concerned or extremely concerned about rising gas prices. Today, we're talking about what's happening with gas prices. We'll also talk about why some countries are able to get cheaper gas and why the oil industry in Venezuela collapsed. Also, there's a big myth that the largest producer of crude oil in the world is a country in the Middle East, but that's dead wrong. Believe it or not, the largest producer is the U.S. We'll talk more about what that even means, and I'll also give you a glimpse of who holds the best quality crude oil in the world. The answer might surprise you. In the 1930s, the average gas price per gallon in the States never went beyond 20 cents a gallon. By the 1950s, we hit the 30-cent mark, and it stayed that way for about 20 years. So much for inflation. But then in the 1970s, the Western world, including the U.S., Canada, Western Europe, Australia, and New Zealand, saw the energy crisis. I'm talking about substantial petroleum shortages and elevated prices. In fact, prices per barrel skyrocketed from $3 to $12. Pretty much Americans saw gas prices rise from 30 cents a gallon to 86 cents. As many of us can recall, there was a huge global recession in the late 1970s and early 1980s. In the 1970s, unemployment went from 5.1% to 9%. And by 1982, unemployment hit 10.8%. That was the highest unemployment rate since the Great Depression. Gas prices shot up to $1.31 a gallon. For the most part, the 2000s saw a steady rise in gas prices. By the summer of 2019, just before the pandemic, average gas price in the U.S. was around $2.70. The pandemic caused gas prices to take a nosedive, and the national average crashed below $2. But we survived the pandemic, and right now the average price is almost $1 more than pre-pandemic levels. But here's the thing. Compared to decades ago, modern cars are a lot more fuel efficient. But regardless of how fuel efficient your car is, it doesn't make paying almost $4 a gallon any less painful. If you've traveled outside the country, you already know there's a huge price disparity in gas prices, depending on the country. Various factors impact that, of course, but a huge part of it comes down to one thing: taxes. Every country has its unique tax on gas. Some countries tax it highly, whereas others don't tax it as much. Here's something that surprises many people. The countries with the biggest crude oil reserves aren't necessarily the world's largest producers of oil, and vice versa. Believe it or not, the U.S. is the largest producer of oil. We also consume the most oil in the world. Yet we don't have the largest reserve. Here in the U.S., we hold just under 36 billion barrels if you count condensate reserves separately. Based on our estimated daily consumption rate of 19.11 million barrels per day, 36 billion barrels of oil would last us just over 5 years. But if you were to include condensate reserves in the count, that estimate is almost double, between 68 to 74 billion barrels. Let's put this in context. Russia has about twice the reserve as the U.S., about 80 billion barrels. It's the third largest producer of oil in the world, producing some 9.4 billion barrels, including condensates. The United Arab Emirates, or UAE, hold nearly 50% more in reserves than Russia. I'm talking 111 billion barrels of crude oil in its reserve. On average, it transports 2.7 million barrels of oil every single day. Canada has an even larger reserve of 171 billion barrels, and it's the fourth largest oil producer in the world. If you add the UAE's reserve and Canada's reserve, pretty much that's the amount of reserve that Saudi Arabia has, which is 267 billion barrels. Back in 2021, Saudi Arabia was producing just over 9 million barrels daily. In 2022, it grew to 11.5 million barrels. By 2027, Saudi Arabia hopes to produce 13 million barrels a day. Right now, Saudi Arabia is the second largest oil producer globally. Now, the holder of the world's largest reserve is also one of the most troubled countries in the world. I'm talking about Venezuela. It holds over 300 billion barrels. You'd think that having the world's largest oil reserve means you'd be one of the biggest oil producers. But actually, that's not the case for Venezuela. Reason for this is due to U.S. sanctions, the current economic crisis in Venezuela, and also internal corruption, all of which makes it difficult for Venezuela to export and capitalize on its rich reserves. In fact, not only is Venezuela not exporting as much, but worse yet, its own people have experienced fuel shortages multiple times. And in fact, at times, the country has had to import oil. But it wasn't always this way. In the 1940s, Venezuela was the third largest producer of crude oil in the world. And by the 1990s and early 2000s, Venezuela was flourishing. But then, the first major oil price slump hit the Venezuelan economy, and it hit hard. Before the country even had a chance to recover, it got hit multiple times by U.S. sanctions, which made things worse. Hugo Chavez became the president of Venezuela in the late 90s, and everything changed. In 2002, Chavez tries to seize control of the oil company Petróleos de Venezuela, or PDVSA. The employees didn't want to go down easy, and they staged a huge strike. To strike back, Chavez fired 19,000 oil workers, and that included a whopping 80% of the country's top engineers. This is one of the biggest factors why the oil situation is so bad in Venezuela. By the way, with the military coup attempt and the chaos, Chavez became convinced that the U.S. was behind the whole plot. So he cut any links Venezuela shared with the U.S., including the oil industry, and he enacted a policy agenda which he called socialism for the 21st century. This turned Venezuela from one of the most prosperous countries in Latin America to a state of humanitarian and geopolitical crisis. Chavez rewrote the Constitution, restricted freedom of the press, nationalized over 1,000 private companies, and destroyed the national currency with hyperinflation. By 2014, Venezuela started rationing out gas to its own people. Part of the reason was because it subsidized domestic gas, which was being smuggled to Colombia for higher prices. By 2017, things got so bad that Venezuela, the country with the largest oil reserves in the world, had to start importing gas from other countries. But let's talk about big oil. Did you know that at the beginning of the 20th century that America had 5 oil giants? Standard Oil of California, Gulf Oil, Texaco, Jersey Standard, and Standard Oil of New York. The first 3 would later end up becoming Chevron, and the last 2 would later become ExxonMobil. At that time, besides the 5 major American companies, there were the 2 big oil giants in the world, and both are British. The British Royal Dutch Shell, which today is known as Shell, and the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, which eventually became BP, or British Petroleum. Joe Biden visited Saudi Arabia trying to convince the prince to produce more oil. Discussions failed, and instead oil prices rose, and the countries that made up OPEC cut their oil production. The Organization for the Petroleum Exporting Countries Plus, or OPEC Plus, is a group of 23 oil exporting countries that meet regularly to decide how much crude oil to sell in the world market. Initially, OPEC was a group of 5 countries that expanded to 13. It produced 20% of the world's total oil. In 2016, OPEC signed an agreement with 10 other oil-producing countries to create what is now called OPEC Plus. Together, the 23 countries are responsible for producing 60% of the world's total oil. OPEC Plus now influences global oil market balances and oil prices more than ever before. In a way, it's like legalized price fixing. The group is so powerful that multiple reporters have asked,
"Are you using energy as a weapon?"
Of course, OPEC Plus denies these allegations.
We are not endangering the energy market. We are providing security, stability to the energy market.
Now let's talk about the best crude oil. Crude oil is a fossil fuel and black liquid found in geological formations. It's formed from dead organisms that are buried under intense heat and pressure. Today there are over 160 different crude oils traded in the market. Oils are labeled based on region and chemical makeup, which in turn defines the quality of oil and therefore the market value. Heavy oil evaporates slowly. It contains material that will be used to make heavy products like asphalt and feedstock for plastics and petrochemical. Oil weight is measured in API gravity units, which measure the density of oil. The lighter the oil, the higher the API. Then there's sweetness. The amount of sulfur determines whether it gets labeled as sweet or sour. Sweet crude is a crude oil with very low levels of sulfur, less than 0.5%. Anything above 0.5% is considered sour. Sour oil requires more processing and treating in order to remove the sulfur. That is why sweeter oil holds more market value. And lastly, there's the TAN count. TAN stands for total acid number. Pretty much, this tells you how corrosive the crude oil is. The smaller the TAN number, the less corrosive it is. Normally, lighter oils have a lower TAN than heavier oils. The best oils are the ones that are light, sweet, and less corrosive. In other words, the one with a high API sulfur content, less than 0.5%, and low TAN count. Needless to say, crude oil with these characteristics tend to be more expensive. When you consider these key characteristics, we see that some of the best oil is produced right here in the U.S. West Texas Intermediate Oil, or WTI, is typically light and only has a sulfur content of less than 0.24%. There's also Brent oil that comes from the Scottish Brent and Ninian systems located in the North Sea. Brent oil is also light and sweet. Oil from OPEC country tends to include 7 different crude oils. Typically, OPEC oil is heavy and sour. Here's the problem. Pumping gas into your car is a relatively quick and easy job, but recharging an EV is a whole different story. Let's put this into perspective. On average, it takes less than 5 minutes to refuel your car with gas. So in 30 minutes, one gas pump can serve 6 cars. If the average gas station has, let's say, 10 pumps, well, that's 60 cars that get serviced in half an hour. On the other hand, in that very same half hour, one EV charging port will service only one EV. To service 60 EVs in 30 minutes, the charging station needs to have 60 chargers. In other words, it takes at least 6 times longer to recharge an EV compared to refueling gas in a combustion engine car. So logic says we need 6 times more charging ports than the current number of gas pumps we have. The average gas station with 10 gas pumps will need to find a way to add 60 charging ports if it wants to service the same quality of vehicle. At the beginning of the 20th century, gas-powered vehicles were gaining popularity. And soon one thing became crystal clear. America needs a more organized, structured way of servicing fuel to the growing number of vehicles. Just step back and imagine living in a time when gas stations weren't as readily accessible as they are today. Let's say you happen to be one of the lucky few who could afford a gas-powered vehicle back then. When it was time to fill up, you didn't have many options to choose from. Back then, you'd need to visit a hardware store to fill up your tank. And finding one of these special hardware stores was a task of its own. Once you arrived, you wouldn't see a self-service gas pump. No, instead the servicemen would pour the gasoline into your car by using a 1 to 5 gallon jug or bucket. I mean, it really was full-service manual labor. Around 1915 was when we first saw the primitive self-service gas pumps. But the process was rather complicated to use. Plus, there wasn't an automatic shutoff. So that meant you could end up spilling gas all over the ground and even on yourself. The process was just very manual, not to mention a possible fire hazard. So you can see why self-service wasn't popular. It didn't hit mainstream back then. In fact, it was actually prohibited in most of the U.S. based on state fire codes. But then came 1939. A man named Richard C. Corson was watching a worker at a loading dock fill a barrel with gasoline. He was appalled at how the manual way was inefficient and a great waste of time. Surely there had to be a better way. Well, they say some of the most brilliant ideas come when you're in the bathroom. So too, Richard Corson had this eureka moment when he heard the toilet flush. That's when he realized the solution to the problem. The butterfly float. In case you don't know, that's what tells the toilet to stop filling up with water. Anyway, that became the inspiration for the basis of the concept that ultimately led to the invention of the automatic cutoff feature we see in gas pumps today. In 1964, John Roscoe started offering self-service fueling in Colorado. This time it really kicked off. And as they say, the rest is history. Today, self-service is a norm in the U.S., well, except in New Jersey where it's still prohibited. Funny enough, gas stations today don't just fill your car with gas, but they also fill our stomachs. The typical modern gas station has a convenience store where you can get your sugar and salt highs. I'm talking sodas, candy, pastries, potato chips, hot dogs, you name it, they got it. Ever wonder how much money a gas station makes from gas? I can tell you, it's not nearly as much as you might think. For simplicity, let's say gas is $4 a gallon. Crude oil costs over half the final price you pay for gas at the pump. Then there's the refining cost of about 50 cents. And don't forget all sorts of taxes, around 15%. Then 8% of cost goes to transporting the gas to the gas station. The gas station takes on a markup of around 7%. And there you have it. Bottom line, which is a shocker to many Americans, gas stations don't make much profit from the sale of gas. Actually, most of their profits come from sales inside the convenience stores. Gas stations keep the gas prices competitive to draw cars in. Reason is, there's very little consumer loyalty in the gas industry. In fact, most Americans fill up at the cheapest station nearby. It's as simple as that. Turns out that more than 50% of the people who come to a gas station also go inside the convenience store. And that's where the money's at. That's why it's very rare to see a gas station without a convenience store these days. If you can think back to the 70s and 80s, you might recall that gas station convenience stores only sold that bare bones basics like cigarettes and sodas, or as the cool kids called it, smokes and cokes. Back then, gas station convenience stores didn't carry much beyond that. It's only in the last 20 years or so that we've seen a big shift where gas stations started merging with convenience stores. But it's not just that. The variety and quality of food has increased. Across the states, it's not uncommon to find gas stations that serve options like pulled pork and mac and cheese, to omelets and black-eyed pea hummus, whatever that is, and even smoothies. It's gotten to the point that some people now choose their favorite gas station based on which gas stations make the better sandwich. And believe it or not, it's also common to see people eat out every week at their favorite gas station. At least a third of the people who go inside a gas station convenience store end up buying something to eat too. Some of the food items these customers are buying have a gross profit margin of over 50%. Funny enough, it's the younger crowd that plays a big part in buying these kinds of food at gas stations. A study in 2019 found that 43% of Americans aged 18 to 29 bought more food from convenience stores than they did 3 years before. Another study a year prior found that restaurant-style foods made up 23% 10% of total gas station sales across the country. But now there's a storm brewing, and it's the market shift. Right now, there are some 100,000 gas stations in the U.S. alone. Around 93% of Americans live within a 10-minute drive from a gas station. So what will happen to all these gas stations as more cars turn electric? Some believe that many gas stations will eventually turn to being convenience stores alone. That doesn't sound unreasonable, but here's the thing. If convenience stores don't have gas to draw cars in, how will they survive? Some gas stations may convert to EV charging stations, but remember, if they want to service the same volume of cars, they'll need to add 6 more ports for every gas pump they presently have. That means they'll need more space. Obviously, it's not a simple or cheap thing to transition into. Remember, too, that charging takes at least 6 times longer than pumping gas. So what will drivers do while they wait half an hour? Americans are not patient people. You see, the customer dynamics is different now. So the gas station needs to redefine its convenience store experience. For now, the long-term fate of gas stations is uncertain. But now you tell me, what's the price of gas in your city? And how high do you think prices will get this year? Please share by commenting below. If you like this video, please like, share, and subscribe. Thanks for your support.